Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you all so much for coming out. We're going to go ahead and start. Thank you for braving this very sudden weather and joining us. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have translators Lisa Hofmann-Kuroda and Susan Bernofsky with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Yoko Tawada's newest book, Exophony, translated by Lisa. But before we get officially started, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First up, if you need to use a restroom at any point, they are right there in that wide door that says employees only. Disregard that for this evening. There will be time for a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. And lastly, after the talk tonight, Lisa will be around to sign and personalize your books at the table next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. Okay, now let's get into this. Exophony is Tawada's first book of essays translated into English, exploring her own relationship with language and through it, questions of identity, belonging, where those borders begin and end. Of course, these topics become even more interesting when you add the component of translating to them, turning them into something new for a new audience, broadening the scope and blurring the lines even more. We are so excited to have not one but two of Tawada's translators with us tonight to discuss all this and more, so let me introduce them super quickly. Lisa Hofmann-Kuroda is a literary translator. Her work includes Ryunosuke Akutagawa's Kappa from New Directions, Yuko Tsushima's Wildcat Dome from FSG, Natsuo Kurino's Swallows from Knopf, and Exophony from New Directions, among others. Born in Tokyo, raised in Texas, she now lives in New York City. And as I mentioned earlier, Susan Bernofsky joins Lisa in conversation. Susan is the translator of works by Robert Walser, Yoko Tawada, Jenny Erpenbeck, Franz Kafka, and Hermann Hesse. A Guggenheim, Coleman, and Berlin Prize Fellow, she directs the program in literary translation in the School of the Arts at Columbia. Her most recent translation is Yoko's pandemic novel, Paul Celan and the Trans-Tibetan Angel, which we also have copies of available for purchase tonight. Okay, that's all from me. Please join me in giving Lisa and Susan a very warm welcome.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Emily. I'm the MC, so I'm going to be MCing. I'm very excited. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations on this book. I love it. I have questions. I know you have two passages that you've selected to read that we'll have shortly, but I thought it would be good for us to start out just sort of establishing like what this book is. Can you just sort of describe what this book is that people might consider purchasing?
Sure. So this is a book of essays. I would say sort of experimental essays. Every single essay in the book is titled after a city that Tawada has spent time in. So it's kind of an interesting way to structure the book. And, at the beginning of every chapter, she starts out giving a sort of anecdote about something she saw or experienced in that city. And then she goes on a really long tangent about language, basically. That's the book. And so for those of you who don't know, Yoko Tawada is Japanese. She was born and raised in Japan. She studied Russian literature, I believe, in school.
Yeah.
And then she ended up in Germany as an adult, I think because her dad had connection to a bookseller there. And so then she ended up studying German and getting really deep into German literary studies in Germany, and then eventually started writing her work in German as well. But she continued to write in Japanese and sort of still goes back and forth. And so, yeah, this book of essays is really interesting because she, to me, I think it's like her grappling with Japanese, actually, as a language, even though she goes into so many different topics. I think, in essence, she's reflecting on her native tongue and her relationship to her native tongue, like refracted through all these other experiences, refracted through her years of living in Germany as, you know, an immigrant or an exile, and how Japan and Japanese looks to her from that distance. And one of the things also that really compels me about her perspective on all of this is that she's just very critical of things, and she doesn't really there's some like sort of diasporic writers that get very nostalgic sort of about their homeland and stuff, and she's always very skeptical of that kind of nostalgia. I think I consider her a very anti-nostalgic
I was specifically
writer.
going to ask you about
Okay,
that, because
cool,
you said
yeah.
in the extremely helpful translators afterward, you called her anti-nostalgic.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's so interesting, because I've never thought about that.
Yeah.
And now I've been thinking about it and what that means.
Yeah.
And I think you're right, but it's complicated.
Yeah. And like this book is also really political, right? I mean, you know, some of the essays are more playful, but some of them are quite political, and she delves into the language politics, the racial politics of, you know, South Africa, Senegal, where she spent some time. Oftentimes she's just jetting off to these different countries because she's been invited to conferences. But, you know, she's really observant about what's going on there and very curious, and she talks to people and just kind of, yeah, she's very astute. So that's just something that really compels me about her, is that she sort of looks back at her own sort of native language with the same curiosity that she would look at a foreign language, right? To her, it's all kind of just like, you know, a medium for play. And so she never really, she kind of resists this kind of essentialism, right? Or nationalism. And she's very skeptical and critical of sort of falling into those traps. So yeah, that's in essence what the book is, but just a very brief summary.
And the chapters, which she refers to as chapters, are all like named with a place. They all have a place and then a title.
Yeah.
So there's like a different theme for every place. I was trying to make a list of all the languages she talks about here. I got French, German, Japanese, Korean, Dutch, Wolof, Chinese. There might be more that I'm forgetting.
I think she mentions like Creole or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a million different. Yeah.
Are there ones that was like harder to translate the discussions of? Because like a lot of times she's talking about words in these languages and like thinking, oh, this is neat, look how this language works. And then she's explaining it to her Japanese language readers.
Right.
And then you are suddenly explaining it to your English language readers.
Right. Yes.
How'd that go?
Yeah, it was tricky. I mean, I think, so I haven't translated her fiction. This is my first book of hers to translate. So like the prose of, you know, just her language in general is not super difficult, but sometimes the ideas that she's trying to express are like pretty complicated and pretty abstract. And she's also talking to a Japanese audience. I mean, that's true of like any book that's ever written, but like, you know, for this one in particular, where the subject is language, and she's, you know, assuming a Japanese audience, she's often sort of explaining words, like German words to them, right? But she's also not explaining Japanese terms, which I then have to explain to an English speaking audience. So, you know, as I said in the translators afterward, Japanese has basically like 3 different writing systems that work together. And so that is an endless source of play for her as someone who loves puns and wordplay. And so that was tricky at times. I had to sort of figure out how to like gloss certain terms, certain Japanese terms without being too obvious about it, or just try to kind of like hint at, you know, what she means by this. So yeah, that was definitely a challenge, but an interesting challenge.
Would you like to maybe read the passage, maybe the Marseille passage?
Yes, so I have, it was hard to pick, but I have 2 kind of sections picked out to read. One, the first one I'm going to read is from the chapter called Marseille. So in this chapter, Tawada goes to Marseille on a sort of interesting artist exchange program, where the point is for different artists to come and read and translate each other's work, even if they don't speak each other's languages. And so they're communicating through an interpreter, basically. And so Tawada goes to France, not knowing French, and is sort of reflecting on what it's like to hear French all day, not understanding any of it. She thought she would be really bored, but she was actually like really fascinated by listening for so many hours to a language that she had no idea what it meant. So she says, listening to a language I didn't understand every day allowed me to experience a special state of mind I had never experienced before. I was paired with a young writer named Veronique Vassiliou, and speaking to her through an interpreter, listening to what she said and then listening to the interpreter translate what I'd said to her meant that I was listening to French for hours a day every day. I expected that that would be a waste of time since I don't speak or understand French, but during the conversation it felt like my whole body had transformed into a giant ear. I couldn't not listen, nor did I feel that listening was a waste of time. Instead, the sounds of the words, the gestures, the body heat and light made me feel strangely fulfilled. Everything was there except for the meaning of the words. And when night fell, something unusual would happen. I would have the strangest dreams, some of the strangest I've ever had in my life, almost as though I'd been drugged. In my dreams, a brightly colored snake slithered languidly across the ground and tree buds glistened in the sunlight. The green of the buds leapt over the boundary separating me, the observer, from the image being looked at and began to extend inside of me. Moreover, it was absolutely clear to me in the dream that the snake and the buds were language itself. But that didn't mean it was abstract. In my dream, this language was raw, so close to my body that it didn't seem possible for it to be any closer. My emotions lost their armor and garments and stood there completely naked. The slightest tremor in the air made me want to cry, scream, even kill. I had a premonition that if things continued this way, something terrible would happen. All distinction was lost between words and things, and my nerves were completely exposed. Is this the kind of world I'd secretly been seeking? It was terrifying, and at the same time, I had never experienced life so vividly. Perhaps at its core, language is merely a potent drug. And then I'll just skip I'll skip to just the end of this chapter, where she says, I realized later that I have never listened to a language I didn't understand for as long as I did then. Thanks to this experience, French has come to occupy a position of pure language in my mind. Some might argue that if I'm going to spend so many hours listening to a language I don't know, I may as well study it. But there's something priceless about that state of unknowingness. I'm sure eventually I will study it, but I want to savor the suspended state of unknowingness for a while. How much creative stimulation can we draw from the state of not understanding at all, or from the state of still understanding only a little? When I was first learning German, I was so desperate to learn it quickly that I never had time to actually notice this. But I think at this point in my life, I can simply observe myself stumbling and falling without feeling too much shame about it, surrendering myself to the state of being unable to communicate. Once people are able to communicate, they do it without thinking.
Exactly. That's like the money shot for
us. That's all well and good, of course, but language also has a mysterious power within it. Maybe what I'm really searching for is a language that has been freed of meaning altogether. Perhaps the reason why I ventured outside of my mother tongue to begin with, and why I keep seeking a world where multiple cultures overlap, is because I am searching for that state just before individual languages are dismantled, freed from their meanings, and finally annihilated.
Wow.
Yeah,
wow.
Very Tawada.
So you're reading this, I'm just thinking, oh my God, The Naked Eye, because like, has anyone read The Naked Eye? She's writing about a character in Paris, but like who can't understand it and all the things that arise from that.
Totally. Yep. And she has, I was actually going to say the other passage I picked out to read is also similar because she has this kind of premonition or dream about this girl who like goes to this country where she kind of understands the language but sort of doesn't, and anyway, so this is a theme for her, obviously. This kind of state of kind of dreaminess or unknowingness.
And this bit about like the way people speak without thinking when they know the language perfectly well. When you feel at home in a language, you just speak without thinking, and then when you are speaking in a language you're not so comfortable, of course, it's like, put the sentence together, is that what I mean, and all that, and it becomes labor. But she's so interested in the way you speak when you have to think harder about it. And there's some story that I translated that I don't even remember which one. I think it was one of the stories in Where Europe Begins, where a character says she distrusts people who speak their native language fluently. Because you can just, make noise and you don't have to think so hard, but it's like, it's honest if you're like exerting yourself in that way.
Totally.
So I know, like in German, like she's completely fluent in German, but she works on estranging German when she's writing it. Do you
Right.
feel that with Japanese in some way? Does she estrange the language?
Well, I think with this book, not so much because she's really just kind of talking to you in this book. But I think she is interested in the same kinds of processes, and there's like, there's moments in here where she's playing with Japanese and trying to defamiliarize it through katakana, for example, which is like one of the syllabary in Japanese that they use for foreign loan words. And so she'll start writing like regular words in that script to kind of like literally defamiliarize the language. It's very odd for like a Japanese speaker or reader to like look at a page of words that you're used to seeing in hiragana and then now they're all in katakana and they look really weird. And so that's just like another kind of tool that she uses to kind of make what is normal and familiar like suddenly look really strange. And so, yeah, I think she does do that to some extent in Japanese too.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. I love this passage so much. In Japanese, are serpent and snake the same word or different words? When you saw snake, because in German it's the same word, and you always have to decide. And I was like, oh no, 'cause, like I think I at least once used serpent. I'm like, did I make a mistake? And it should have been snake. Are they the same word? Or
I think
different?
it's just the same. It's just heavy, yeah.
So you have
in
to
Japanese.
decide every time.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. I didn't really think about that too closely in this one, but yeah.
On the other hand, like Germans have like two different words for what we call deer, the animal, Hirsch, and what's the other one?
Reh?
Hirsch and Reh, exactly. And like,
Hirsch is the boy.
it's two different species.
Oh.
One is masculine. Anyway, but in English we're just saying deer and like, I don't know. There's all these bifurcations of decision.
Yeah.
Which are then tonal and I read.
What are the two in German? Like, what's the difference between the two deer?
I think that it's different species, but Claudia, who's a first language speaker of German, says that it's male and female.
Like a doe.
The Hirsch is definitely masculinized.
Yeah.
I looked this up though for
But
translation.
the
Stag,
reh,
like piglet?
the reh is
Like a doe and a stag
Yeah.
or something.
Hey. we could anyway. This event is not about German. So. You should always defer. You should always defer to the first language speaker. They always know. They speak the language. They speak the language properly. I do not. I do not. Okay. Speaking of which, she says some really interesting things about translation that I was excited about. On page 111, she talks about mistranslation. I wanted to bring up this stuff. This is in her chapter called Moscow, which is subtitled, Who Cares If It Doesn't Sell? Which, in this, here we are, capitalism is killing us. Our Senate has just, decided that all, any retirement benefits that you might want to have someday are going to go to some billionaire tomorrow instead. Why save for the future? Anyway, who cares if it doesn't sell? So she says here, anyone who believes that any text can cross any border and circulate freely simply because we have translators is mistaken. In fact, the majority of texts in the world are either not yet translated or have already been mistranslated. Saying this might imply a rather monotone world, but to me it appears overflowing with color. We cannot travel without carrying the baggage of mistranslation. And I feel like, in a nutshell, that's like everything I love about Tawada. She herself is like, and I feel like she gives her translators this opportunity to mistranslate. It's like an invitation. She's not interested in like exactitude and correctness. Like correctness is of no interest to her.
Yeah.
Whatsoever.
Yeah.
So
Definitely.
I don't know. I always feel like you get to play when you translate her.
Yeah. She's she gave me full blessing. She never tried to nitpick me or track me down for anything.
Did you send her questions while you were working?
I didn't actually. Yeah, I kind of felt like I got it. But yeah, she talks about it too in the end of the book with, she's talking about a German translation of like a very old Japanese text, and her friend was like, oh, they didn't translate this word correctly, and she kind of thinks about it and she's like, well, technically, like, that's like the literal translation of it, and it's actually like more poetic and more beautiful, and so I think it's actually fine. And so yeah, she is very like interested in mistakes, and mistakes, like, she thinks that, yeah, mistakes are what lead to interesting sort of outcomes. So yeah, I find that really refreshing about her too. Yeah.
So what about the politics of exophony, which you mentioned before?
Yeah.
Like, can you, in a nutshell, like what
What is
what's the takeaway from here?
Yeah.
I flagged some passages about this,
Yeah,
but like,
yeah.
You're the translator. You know this book better than me.
Yeah, so I assumed it was like a word that she made up, but it's not. It's a word that she heard at this conference that she went to in Senegal, where there were discussions about, French-speaking Senegalese writers and sort of like the politics around that. And so I think that's where she first heard the language, or heard the word, and she was really interested in it because of its kind of like value neutrality, I think. Like, we have all these, she says, like, we have all of these different terms like immigrant literature, minority literature, translated literature, but they always kind of imply sort of like a direction, like, an immigrant is someone who goes from this place to this place.
From bad place to good place.
Right, totally, exactly. And there's all these like judgments she talks about where, she does talk about different African writers, for example, who, choose to write in French or, English, which are technically like colonial languages, and they get judgment about that. Like, oh, you should be writing in, these like smaller languages because if you don't use those, they're going to go extinct or something. And she's kind of like, she kind of is like, I don't think that's right. People choose to write in the medium that they write in. And so yeah, exophony literally just means outside of the language, so exophone. And so it's anyone who is writing outside of their mother tongue. So, but that could mean so many different things. Like, it could mean someone who, is writing in a second language because they had to, because they were colonized and that language was forced on them. Or it could be that, they're choosing to do it for some political reason, or they're an immigrant. But like, yeah, I think she's interested in it for its neutrality, right? That there's so many different actually like kinds of situations in which people either choose or are compelled to do that. And it's a lot more common than we think. And she also has this really interesting chapter on German writers. So she spends some time in Los Angeles, and she talks about how there were all these German writers who, were exiled basically to California after being forced out by the Nazis, including Thomas Mann. And how it was really interesting for her to observe that despite, leaving Germany and like living in the US sometimes for a long time, like they never stopped writing in German. Whereas like she's observing other writers, immigrant writers who come to Germany who then start to write in German, right? And so there's all kinds of like, political pressures and decisions that are wrapped up in that. But she kind of speculates on why that is.
And she even says at one point that she feels like, as a writer who was not colonized and therefore not forced to write somebody else's language, one doesn't have the right to make judgments about exophonic decisions.
Right, totally, yeah. She speaks about it in the beginning in this kind of, excited way, like, there's so many possibilities that can be opened up by this concept. But then she goes to Korea, right, and she goes to a conference in Seoul, and she starts thinking about it differently, because there she is, Japan colonized Korea in the late 19th century, and there's a really brutal history there. And so and part of that colonization process was the Japanese government like literally like banning the Korean language, right, and like forcing Koreans to speak in Japanese and read in Japanese in school. So she's kind of like, oh, what does exophony mean in this context, you know, and like, what does it mean for me to be here? And so, yeah, I mean, she's really cognizant of those power dynamics between languages too. It's not just like cosmopolitan celebration. It's like, no, you know, all of these languages have a history and a politics, and there's power differentials here that I think she's really careful in like the way that she thinks about that and her own positionality in that. Yeah.
German, I think, is actually her fourth language.
Oh, is it
Because
really?
because she learned English in school.
Right,
I
and
mean,
then
so
Russian.
Japanese and then Russian, which
Oh my
she,
God.
I think, spoke fluently at the time.
Wow,
Yeah.
amazing.
Which is also like Naked Eye, because like the character speaks Russian. And it's like, if I can only get to Moscow, then I'll be able to find my way home. I don't know.
Yeah.
Speaking of find way home, like the trilogy that New Directions is currently publishing, the Scattered All Over the Earth trilogy, if you have not read at least one volume of this, like it is so great. Scattered All Over the Earth. It's like it's a road trip and buddy story. Like there's a woman from a country that no longer exists and is never named. Sounds a bit like Japan, but it's, you know, and she hears that there's somebody in Europe who speaks her language, and then she sets out on this quest to go find this person who speaks her language. Although, so it's sort of nostalgic, but also not really. It's still not quite nostalgic, but she's curious. She wants to meet this other person. She picks up this international group of buddies, and it's like this great road trip story. So Scattered All Over the Earth is the first volume. So volume 2, Suggested in the Stars, is out, and Archipelago of the Sun, volume 3, is forthcoming in September.
Amazing.
I cannot wait. I've been reading this so excitedly. Would you like to read the other passage you picked?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the other passage I have picked out is the one I mentioned earlier. It's called Cape Town. So this is when she's in South Africa. On a similar theme to the other passage, actually. But this was one of my favorite to translate. So she says, people often ask what language I dream in, a question I always find slightly annoying. Implicit in the question is the assumption that it's impossible for people to truly speak two languages, that one of them must be the fake language and the other must be the real language. There is a word in Japanese for this, nimaijita, or fork-tongued, which implies that those who speak two languages are liars. Here are some related questions I recall people asking me over the years. I know Japanese is your mother tongue, but aren't you basically German at this point? No matter how long you speak German, won't your soul always be Japanese? Which language do you feel like you can really express your true self in? Essentially, soul, true self, I despise phrases like these. People seem to have a burning desire to know which language corresponds to the real me. They assume that however skilled I may be at crafting lies in my fake language while I'm awake, the real me must only emerge in my dreams, in the true language. But the truth is that the real me speaks multiple languages. So in my dreams, I speak multiple languages too. I don't just dream in German and Japanese. I also have dreams where I'm struggling to speak English or some other language like Polish that I don't recall ever having studied. I even have nightmares in Spanish sometimes, a language I don't even speak a word of. In this particular nightmare, I'm standing in front of an audience getting ready to read my work. When I look closely at my manuscript, however, it's written in Spanish and I can't understand it at all, though the words on the page are undoubtedly my own. My heart begins to pound, cold sweat trickles down my forehead, and I feel like I'm suffocating, and suddenly I wake up. There's a saying in German, das kommt mir Spanisch vor, it's all Spanish to me, meaning something is completely unintelligible. Perhaps that is where my nightmare comes from. After all, dreams are sometimes literal manifestations of idiomatic phrases, which tells me that I'm probably dreaming in German, since the story in my nightmare is a literalization of a German phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And why is it that in German you say it's all Spanish to me, and in English we
all
say it's all
Greek
Greek to me?
Yeah.
Like who picked these languages to be incomprehensible?
As the
Like,
weird, whatever was the far away, was considered the far away country, yeah.
Oh my God.
So then she kind of talks about this short story that she writes. She says, I was so annoyed by the question about what language I dreamed in that it prompted me to write a novel, Night by Bioskop, which is about a girl who dreams in a language that she can't understand. And so then, yeah, that kind of takes her to talking about German and Afrikaans and, you know,
Yeah.
how they're like slightly different, but like kind of sound the same. Yeah.
So then I went and looked for that story. It's like a 30-page story, and I'm like, oh my God. So like in publishing Yoko Tawada, like, you know, New Directions has been publishing for, you know, 25 years now, looking to build an audience for her in English. And so, like, of course, like novels are, you know, novels, people love novels, novels sell well, so like front load those. But she does have lots of collections of essays. And I'm like, oh my God, because a lot of her essays are very story essay-like. And I'm like, Bioscope, they're not, how come this hasn't been translated yet? Now I want to translate it. But it's like amazing, amazing, amazing story. It's been translated into Dutch. I have the Dutch translation here if anybody wants. So we have it in German and Dutch. But like, it's so great. It starts with language too. Like it starts, a man stands in front of me. He shows me with his index finger, he points to approximately the place where probably his heart lies, and then says, Die Mann, which if you know German, like the nouns have gender, and man is masculine, and die is the feminine article. So it's like, it's confusing. And my laugh nerves twitched. I was confused. Are you feminine? and the person says, no, not anymore. He used to be a woman covered with countless tiny clitorises, but then he had all the raised spots removed from his skin so that he could become entirely a man. And like, she's so crazy. She's so like there's so much wildness in her writing. And like reading this book in your translation was also really exciting to me, because like we're different generations, and Margaret Mitsutani is also like, she's even older than me. So it's like Yoko Tawada has been translated by people of a different generation, and now suddenly she's being translated by you, and the language is like really perky. And like, I really enjoyed reading it, and I also felt like the generational difference.
Interesting. Huh?
And I really enjoyed it.
Huh.
It's like, I don't know.
So happy.
It's like she's generational, transcendent, but that's how it's supposed to be anyway.
Yeah, I feel like that's like appropriate for Tawada somehow.
Yeah.
Like all these different translations.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, it's getting around to be that part where we're supposed to open up to audience questions, and I think I'm supposed to be calling on people. Is that the rule? All right, that's the rule. I'm calling on people. So if you have a question, you could raise your hand, please.
Hi, thank you. I have a follow-up question about that Paris one, and as it might relate to Naked Eye. I'm wondering like, when this essay might have been written, if you know that, and it's just so surprising to me for her to think that it would be boring to go to Paris and not understand anything, having written a whole novel about how someone is so mesmerized by the experience that she can't bring herself to just call mom and leave.
Yeah. It says that she went to Marseille in 1999. I don't know when she actually wrote the essay. But I think she was more like skeptical about like the program, because it was like 2 weeks where you just be sitting with someone, like sitting and talking with someone who you like literally couldn't understand. And so she was like, what is this going to be like? But then she was just like very fascinated by this.
That predates The Naked Eye.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
this is like 22 years ago. This book.
Yeah, this book is quite old actually. Yeah, it was written, yeah.
That's another astonishing thing about it. It's like, it reads like something she could have written this year.
I know, that was also really striking
Also
to
the
me.
political stuff.
Right.
It's so relevant.
She's so woke, even though it was early 2000s.
Yeah. Yeah,
I was very
completely.
impressed by that too, because I remember reading this book like a really long time ago in Japanese, but yeah, it really like kind of holds up.
She's
like,
even writing about immigration law and
Right.
and like discriminatory changes
Right.
to immigration law. Like in Austria, there's a law that they had just passed in 2002 that like all foreigners would have to take a language exam,
test,
or be expelled from the country. Like,
and she
although
was-
you know.
yeah.
I hope it's not in the bill the Senate just passed. God help us.
Yeah. Definitely.
Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
I was wondering a bit about the, since there's like so many references to German at the end, I assume this is in the original Japanese also as the translation for the German into Japanese, but then then here it also has to be, I assume, the Japanese parts that you translated or like given reference to in English. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious about that phenomenon, sort of just that multiple translation.
Mhm.
I assume in the original Japanese there was just the one to German.
Right.
Or,
Yeah.
so yeah, I was wondering about that sort of did like balloon up the text a little bit to have to that in.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, she's definitely like, I think, well, in the Japanese, when she says something in German, like a phrase, she will translate it. She'll always translate it into Japanese for her readership, because she assumes they don't know German. So for those, I would just translate what she had put in Japanese into English. So basically doing the same thing that she was doing, just for an English-speaking audience, they could also understand the German. But then anytime there was a lot of sort of unexplained Japanese words, right, that would need some kind of gloss. So for those, I had to put something in. But I don't think it made the book too much longer. I don't know. I mean, maybe it would have cut down on some pages if I hadn't done that, but it also would have been pretty hard to understand without. So I think it was probably the right move.
It's also like totally in her spirit to do that.
Yeah.
Like if
yeah.
you had asked her, she would have said, do that.
Right, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a question? Hand in the middle back there? Yes.
Well, at the beginning, you guys talked a bit about how she's skeptical of nostalgia. I'm wondering if you'll come back to that because I would wonder, it makes sense with some of the other stuff you guys were saying, like how language is kind of like this fun play kind of thing, and so maybe it's not as deep of a thing for her.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't read the book yet, so I'm wondering like where it fits into the other themes and where you read that.
Yeah. She's very critical of Japan in this book, and I really appreciate that about her. She's really critical of Japanese nationalism. She's really critical of, I mean, this is still true. Japanese people like really haven't faced there's a lot of historical denialism in Japan still today, a lot of unpacked racism, and so she's very critical of those things. And there's also like this concept of like the Heimat in German language, right, and culture of like the hometown, this kind of nostalgia for a particular locale or identity, and that totally exists in Japan too. And in fact, a lot of that was like lifted from the Germans in the early 20th century. So she's very like cautious about those things because she knows where that leads politically. And I think it's just like not interesting to her. I think like this idea that we are sort of bound by like one kind of national identity or culture or language, and that sort of limits the totality of like who we are somehow is just like so antithetical to who she is. And it is really striking to me because I can think of a number of other Japanese writers, like specifically Japanese diasporic writers who have like, spent a lot of time away from Japan. And a lot of times their politics go in the opposite directions where they become, the longer they spend away from Japan, the more nostalgic they become for it and the more kind of nationalistic they become. I've seen this happen a lot. Like Minai Mizumura is like one of those writers where she's just like, she's also a bilingual writer, but she's so like, it's totally the opposite of Tawada, where she's just like, everything Japan related is great and everything in America is bad. And like, it's very sort of binary. And Tawada is totally the opposite. Like she totally rejects that kind of thinking, like, no matter how much time she spends away from Japan, like there might be certain things she appreciates about it, but she never has this kind of nostalgic backward glance of like, oh, things were better there. And, that's where I really belong. And, only other Japanese people really understand me. Like she never goes there. And she's like, well, there's a lot of Japanese people that don't understand me because I'm weird.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of German people that really get me, So she's just kind of like, she's very open-minded about, she doesn't really assume anything about people because of where they're from or what language they happen to speak or choose to speak in, And it's always this process of like reinvention for her. I think that's what really interests her about language. So, yeah.
I would just like to say one thing. It's not really a question, or maybe a little bit of a question, but what Yoko Tawada has done for me is that she gave me a very specific love for my mother tongue, German, because she has a way of playing with this very actually flexible and creative language, because you constantly can make these composite
Mhm,
words, and we
mhm.
do this, but she makes them out of very odd elements.
Yeah.
She fuses these strange connections.
Yeah.
And she's encouraged me to be more bold about
That's wonderful.
yeah. So it's,
Yeah.
and I wonder that she is that the same in other languages, that she finds the one
Yeah.
defining thing and then makes something very unusual out of
I
it.
I think that her fluency in German also impacts how she plays with Japanese, right? Because she'll make these compounds in Japanese in the same way that you make compound words in English. So like in the preface, she has this really fun word, aruki yoyoida, which is not a word in Japanese, but it's like a compound of the word to walk and to swim. So it's kind of like she swim walks about the world, and like yeah, that's definitely something you can do in German, right? To kind of compound these words together, but she does it in Japanese, and just she doesn't comment on it. She just does it as though it's a normal word, and so yeah, it's really funny.
All right, we'll take the Patricia in front, and then in the back, and then you third.
Thank you for translating this, and thank you for the conversation. It really reads, I only read the first chapter as if it were had been written a year ago. It really does.
Yeah.
I was wondering, is there anything about self-translation in the book? And then, of course, knowing her, how does she cope with that, or how does she play with self-translation? How far does she take it in terms of mistranslation or transcreation?
I don't think she talks about self-translation in this
Not in this one.
book. Yeah,
She did more of
specifically.
that later than in this book, too.
Okay, maybe this was too early because this was early 2000s. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe, but she has other essay collections in Japanese, so she may talk about it there. Yeah.
I know that, like, in the Memoirs of a Polar Bear, which I translated from German, she had written that first in Japanese, translated herself into German, and then I translated her translation. And her translation, it's very funny because, like, she tells us to translate Wild and Crazy, but she herself was, I think, a little, like, I'm translating the bears that Knut meets in the zoo, and he's meeting like the collared bear, and he's meeting the Malayan bear, and I'm like, in German, and then I'm looking it up, and it's like, oh, this one could be sun bear, and this one could be moon bear. And then I look up, what these bears were in Japanese, and of course, in the original Japanese, they were sun bear and moon bear. But in German, these bears have different names, and she had to choose between in German, it would have read more as fairy tale names because they weren't the official names. In Japanese, she could get away with it more, and in English, she could get away with it more. So I'm like, okay, but that was information about her practice. Yes, and back, please.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to talk about the idea of like how this book feels like, people say this book feels like if we read it today or like a year ago. I actually feel like it kind of makes sense when you said that it was written like 20 or something years ago. I think there is this sort of almost like nostalgic like idea or like this high optimism for like globalism, globalization.
Interesting,
That's
yeah.
like a symbol here that's like feels to me, I mean like I wasn't
That's a good
born
point.
back then, but like it
Yeah.
feels to me that it's very like 90s and early.
Right. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Like,
That's a good point.
You open this book and like the table of contents like all these cities.
Yeah.
This idea of like you could like be this like free traveler through these cities.
Yep.
And like take experiences.
Totally.
And it's so interesting how ambitious that project it seems to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder like under what circumstances were these essays even written, because they're so perfectly formally kind of like similar, like it's hard for me, like, it's probably not like it's written for different magazines and stuff like that. It seems to me that it's like a kind of totalized like project. And was she kind of like trying to consciously do this, where like she would go to these cities and try to put together this travelogue, or like under what circumstances was this made?
That's a great question. I haven't really asked her about that. I
To
don't
me,
know.
it feels like
Like
that
a
feels,
project, yeah.
No, it feels like to me like she wrote it together.
Yeah, rather than just kind of serialized.
But she
separate
does that.
essays.
She like Opium for Ovid is like, she likes to set projects like that where she'll decide on a structure and then write to the structure. So
Yeah, she says in the preface that She had some kind of other structure at first for the chapters, and then she decided to use city names, and then suddenly like it all made sense to her somehow. So maybe she went through a few iterations. But that is a good point about the globalization. Like there is a kind of optimism like to the book for sure, and a lot of privilege and being able to just go to all these different places freely, cross all these borders, and obviously a lot of people can't do that. So yeah.
She does write more about the limitations of travel,
Yeah.
like in the trilogy, for example.
Oh yeah,
So
for sure. Yep. Yeah, definitely.
You had a question?
Yeah, so one anecdote I really liked in the book is when she goes, I think, to Canada at the festival, and she finds herself in the category of literature of color. She's like, oh, that's because my books are really colorful. And so I guess my question is somewhat related to what has been discussed before, but do you think the book would have been any different had she been an immigrant in the US and not in Germany?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah.
She talks
Most
specifically
definitely.
about the U.S.
She does. I think she would have been a completely different kind of writer. Like,
She's like, young people in the United States are different from young people in Europe. As expected in a country of immigrants, they feel complete ownership over their adopted country and language, which is why Americans have never asked me whether I consider myself German or Japanese. Instead, they ask me why I don't write in English since I am in America.
Yeah, I think she has quite a lot of disdain for the U.S. and for English in general. I mean, she knows English, but she'll avoid it if she can.
She spent more time here now than like when she wrote this.
Yeah.
Too. There was another question back here somewhere, wasn't there? Maybe not. My peripheral vision. How are we doing?
I think we have time for one or two more.
Anyone want it? Okay, back there and then here. Hi, Emma.
This is going to be a kind of silly question, but I'm unfamiliar with Yogeshwara's work, and I'm curious: do you two have a sense of when is she writing books in German versus in Japanese? Is there is it that the older books are in Japanese and she started writing more? So is there a way of thinking about when she chooses to write in which language?
Sometimes she changes her mind in the middle. Like the Naked Eye, she wrote the first chapter in German and the second chapter in Japanese, and then she just sort of like wrote each chapter in whichever language she felt like, and then translated them and had 2 complete manuscripts and sent one to her Japanese publisher and one to her German publisher and said, here's my new book.
Yeah, I think she's pretty continuously written in both, and
she likes to hop around.
Yeah, and she also says in the book, like, she talks about it as a muscle that atrophies if she's not actively using it, and so she's consciously writing in both to kind of keep those muscles alive.
I have an exciting announcement. Her German publisher has announced that she has a new novel forthcoming in German called Eine Affäre ohne Menschen, Roman, an affair without humans. And it's announced on the website. One can pre-order it. There's a cover, but she's still writing it. It's a love story that's not told from the perspective of human beings, but rather that of objects and natural phenomenon, such as showerhead, fried egg, the shadow of a tree, and an umbrella. This reminded me of Sharon Dodo Otu's book, Ada's Room, Adam's Realm, by the way.
Wow.
Another great book translated from German. Anyway, you had a question.
I don't know if you guys talked about this, but is there any difference in experience from translating her from German and translating her from Japanese?
I'm sure.
I don't know.
I'll never know.
Yeah, I'll never know. I know a little bit of German, but I can't really, not enough to translate. So, yeah.
I'm sure it's a different experience, but who knows how?
Yeah.
Only the person who can do both.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, only
exactly.
she does.
We should ask her. Anyway, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me to speak with you. This was so fun.
Thanks for coming. Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your questions. Yay, Lisa. Buy the book. It's great.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you again to Susan for moderating such a great conversation. And thank you, Lisa, for being here
Thank
to
you.
celebrate this launch.
Yeah,
with
thanks for
us.
having us. This was great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So, some final reminders before we all wrap up and head home, hopefully as dry as possible. If you're still with us on the live stream, you can buy a copy by clicking the link in the description. For those of you with us tonight, we have plenty of additional copies of Exophony, Paulson and the Transfen Angel, and Wildcat Dome available for purchase at the register where you checked in. Lisa will be around to sign and personalize your books as well. That's going to be happening also back there. So we're going to have you all just line up along these shelves here. Please make sure to grab all of your personal belongings with you
Yeah.
so we can start to break down and rearrange the space. And thank you all again for joining us. Let's give these two one last round of applause.